Welcome to part 1 of our CLM video series. In this video, we're going to be answering the question, what are the different focus points in a CLM system? And when I say system, I'm not just talking about software. It could be a software, or it could even be a process. So let's take a quick look at what are the focus points when putting together a CLM system. I'm going to quickly share my screen. So when thinking of the entire life cycle of a contract, I like to put it into 3 buckets. Pre-execution, which is everything that you need to do before executing the contract. Execution, which is the signing of the contract. And post-execution, which is everything that needs to be done once the contract is signed and executed. So let's jump into these buckets, starting with pre-execution. The first point of any contract is the request, where somebody comes in and says, we need a contract for XYZ. It could be a simple NDA. It could be a master services agreement. It could be a shareholders agreement. It could be a vendor contract, any sort of a contract. But it has started with a request from either business or operations or any department of the company that has come in and said, we need this contract in place. Now, you could either have a simple email that provides this request, or you could actually have a detailed intake request form wherein you're providing a little bit more context to the contracts. You're providing the details of whether the counterparty is a vendor or a supplier, who is the counterparty, have we worked with them before, what is the business purpose and the context to that agreement. So that could be your process for the intake request. Let's look at creating. Now, if you're creating the contract, you're either working on your own standard drafts, so you possibly have your templates or precedents in place. Alternatively, you could be working on a new contract for which you do not have a precedent in place, and you need to work on that contract from scratch. Either way, you're creating your draft for the contract. The other approach is when you're reviewing third-party paper, which essentially means you're reviewing somebody else's contract, and you're reviewing it in the context of whether it is in compliance with your company principles or not. So for instance, you may have an internal company principle where you do not agree to open-ended NDAs. So if I receive an NDA and it is open-ended, I need to immediately flag that this is not in compliance with our internal company policy. So this is what is known as reviewing third-party paper, where I am looking at a counterparty's draft and trying to see whether it is in line with my company policy. In either of these steps, whether you're creating your own document or you're reviewing third-party paper, you will work with the counterparty to negotiate all of the clauses before they are signed. And sometimes during the negotiation process, you need to obtain approvals or sign-offs from different stakeholders within the company. You may need a credit sign-off for a specific clause. You may need sign-off from finance or litigation, or even the business or operations team need to sign off on certain clauses. And sometimes there may be a requirement for you to record all of these internal sign-offs. So that is the process of obtaining all of the internal approvals. Once all of the negotiation is completed and your internal sign-offs are obtained, you move on to the actual execution of the contract. Now, this can be an execution through wet signature or e-signature. It doesn't matter what you're following for that contract. And in some companies, you may be following a combination where sometimes you're executing some contracts through wet signatures, the traditional way where you physically sign the document, and other contracts may be just e-signatures. That's the actual execution process. After the contract is executed, you look towards managing the contract. What are the obligations of my company under this contract? There may be some reporting obligations where MIS needs to go out every quarter. There may be a payment obligation or on a monthly basis, or there may even be an operational obligation. And each of these obligations may be tied in with different stakeholders within the company. So for instance, your payment obligation needs to be managed by the finance team. Your operation team needs to know when the contract is going to expire, because if they want to renew it, they will have to give that much notice to the counterparty that they are planning to renew the contract. So management of contracts, signed contracts, becomes extremely important, because it's not just the legal team that looks at this. Sometimes you will have other teams that will need to manage other portions of the contract. So what is the process that is in place for the obligation management of the contract? And sometimes you need to get a macro analysis view of all of your contracts. So maybe I need to know which are all the contracts where my company has agreed for an open-ended indemnity. Or I might need to know which are all the contracts has my company agreed to arbitration in Singapore. The company could have thousands of contracts, and in that instance, I may need to be able to extract specific information points from the contracts to obtain a macro view of all of them. So sometimes that's also important. And what sits neatly behind all of this, or I would say at the center of all of this, is your repository or storage. Where are you storing all of this information? How is your intake request coming in? Is it coming in through an email? Where are the different versions of the contract being stored? Because during the negotiation process, you can go through several versions of a contract. And how are these being stored? Where are all your internal approvals being stored and recorded? Where are the signed agreements being stored? How is the obligation management and the workflow built around that being managed? So you need to have a sense of where is all of this information going to be stored and what is the process around that storage. This is critical, and I'll tell you why. If the person who's actually storing the documents leaves, it needs to be such that the next authorized person will be able to come in, look at the storage, and easily identify which is the contract they need to pull out, which is the negotiated version, which is the signed version, and what is the obligation management in place. Or sometimes you even need to look at what are the internal approvals that were provided and who provided these approvals for this contract to be executed. So in a nutshell, this is the entire contract lifecycle management process, and these are the different focus points in that process. Thanks for watching.